Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our COVID-19 Tele-Town Hall. Whether it's your first time joining, your eighth time, or somewhere in between, welcome, and thank you for your commitment to staying informed. It's because of each of you that Massachusetts has been able to slow the spread of this virus. But as we have seen in so many states around the country, we are a country in crisis. Right now, 41 states are experiencing increased cases, and 25 states have seen the number of COVID-related deaths increase in the last 2 weeks. Nationally, more than 4 million people have tested positive for the virus, and sadly, nearly 145,000 Americans have died. Here in Massachusetts, more than 114,000 people have tested positive, and over 8,400 people have passed away from COVID-19. Each of those numbers represents a tragic loss of life and an untold sorrow for families across the country. And even as our state continues to contain this virus and reopen responsibly, we must do so with the understanding that this virus is extremely dangerous, and we all still have an important role to play in limiting its deadly spread. While we remain in the throes of this pandemic nationally, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the incredible progress we've made here in the Commonwealth. According to the governor's team, the positive rate is down about 95%, and the number of hospitalizations is down 85% since April. But COVID-19 continues to have a devastating economic toll on our families. 25 million people remain unemployed because of the virus, and we're dangerously close to the expiration of a number of vital relief measures for families across the nation. Without additional action by Congress, enhanced unemployment benefits, the extra $600 per week that folks have been getting to offset the costs associated with losing their jobs or being furloughed because of this crisis, will expire tomorrow. The moratorium on evictions from federally assisted rental properties or homes with a federally backed mortgage expire tomorrow as well. And for most families, the $1,200 payments received in the spring, well, they've been spent already to help offset the cost of everyday expenses. On top of the mounting economic concerns, families across this district are struggling with decisions pertaining to back to school and childcare. Like many parents, I've spent nights worrying about what this fall will bring for our college-age boys and our elementary-age daughters. With so many questions looming, there are a few things Congress must prioritize: funding for schools, funding for our state and local governments, and an expansion of the benefits families and small businesses are counting on in order to make it through these difficult times. More than 2 months ago, I voted to pass the HEROES Act, which, if signed into law, will provide $3 trillion in additional financial assistance to working families, to schools, to prepare for the fall, and get immediate relief to all of our frontline workers. Specifically, the HEROES Act provides a second round of direct cash payments of up to $1,200 per person or $6,000 per family, an extension of enhanced unemployment benefits of an extra $600 per week through the end of the year for those who continue to be unemployed or are forced back into unemployment because of surges in COVID. $100 billion in rental assistance and another $75 billion in assistance for homeowners who need help paying their mortgage, utility payments, and property taxes. $14 billion for our food security programs. $1 trillion in funding to support heroes, including our first responders, our healthcare workers, and essential personnel working in state and local governments. Our cities and towns are struggling to keep people on payroll at a time when they're providing emergency services that have been saving lives for months. And $90 billion in funding to be distributed to states to stabilize our K-12 schools and our colleges. Massachusetts would receive $1.5 billion in additional funding for education through this stabilization fund. After much delay, the Senate is finally coming to the negotiating table. In the coming days and weeks, we expect details of a coronavirus relief package to emerge, but we need to act with urgency. Kids, families, frontline workers, and small businesses across our communities are depending on it. Now, I'd love to take a moment to introduce our two incredible panelists who will join me in answering your questions about COVID-19 and what the future holds. Our first guest hardly needs an introduction, especially if you've turned on your TV these last 4 months or tuned into one of our previous telephone town halls. Dr. Ashish Jha is the director of the Harvard Global Health Institute and KT Lead Professor of Global Health at Harvard University. And in just a few weeks, he will be taking over as Dean of Brown University School of Medicine. In addition to being a practicing general internist and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Jha has also been one of the leading voices on this public health crisis. I was very proud to recently welcome him to virtually brief the House Education and Labor Committee, and I'm so grateful to him for taking the time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule to join us this afternoon. Dr. Jha.
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's a delight and a pleasure to be here, so thanks for having me on.
Oh, the pleasure is ours. And I'll introduce our second guest, who has been doing incredible work for children in the city of Lawrence. Cynthia Paris is the superintendent of Lawrence Public Schools and will be leading the way as the city charts its path forward for the school year this fall. Superintendent Paris worked in the Boston public school system as a speech pathologist and a principal for 17 years before being named the assistant superintendent of elementary education in Newton. During her time in Boston, Superintendent Paris served as the turnaround principal of William Blackstone Innovation Elementary School, where she spearheaded efforts to transform the chronically underperforming school. She has been especially busy since the start of this public health crisis, getting students in Lawrence through the end of the last school year. And over the past few weeks, she has been working per the state's guidance to create 3 different plans for a return to school this fall. I know how incredibly valuable your time is, Cynthia, so thank you again for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today.
So our first question is from William B. of Townsend, and I don't know why the first question always comes to me because I feel like I've done so much of the talking already, but William B. from Townsend asks this. Will you propose to extend the stimulus to the unemployed beyond next week? People are just left out on the street. The unemployment rate is still over 20%. Help. And a companion question to Williams, what's the status of Congress's extension of $600 for unemployment insurance? That comes from James B. in Hudson. Well, William and James, I want to thank you both for submitting these important questions. Just because our state economy is moving into a phased reopen, it does not mean that we are out of the woods. With enhanced unemployment benefits running out for millions of Americans at the end of this month, Congress is pressed to act swiftly. We're gearing up for a fight or a negotiation. There's been a lot of back and forth about whether to extend the boosted unemployment insurance provision in the upcoming relief package. As you know, in the CARES Act, the coronavirus package that we passed in late March, we included a $600 per week boost to unemployment benefits, which helped millions of workers, including gig workers and contractors who were laid off or furloughed across the country. You know, our country is facing historic long-term economic damage from COVID-19. Families are afraid of being evicted. They're worried about feeding their kids, and I refuse to roll the dice on their lives. So unemployment benefits serve as a lifeline, and I absolutely support the extension of supplemental unemployment benefits and will continue doing so to prevent these economic consequences from becoming permanent. I expect at a minimum some form of expanded unemployment insurance to appear in the next relief package, which we're in D.C. right now as we speak, working on that. And just know that I'll be advocating for a robust, enhanced UI that will keep our families afloat during this difficult time. Okay, Dr. Jha, this one is for you, and it's from Richard D. He writes, is it possible to have enough rapid testing in place when schools open in September? There will be a huge demand to keep these kids safe.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, testing is an area where I think Massachusetts has been doing a very good job of kind of continuing to ramp up. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen an additional sort of 30 to 40% increase in testing, and we're doing about 10 to 12,000 tests a day in the Commonwealth. The question is, will we have enough for schools this fall? And you really need rapid tests, right? Because you can't have the one test where it takes 5 or 7 days to turn around, because that's pretty useless. What I have increasingly come to believe is that we do need rapid tests. We need them available, and we probably have to go to other testing modalities. And so right now, without getting too scientific on people here, the main test we use is what's called a PCR test. That's really getting strained across the Commonwealth and across the country. And while we can ramp that up a little bit more, we need these kind of antigen-based tests, these swabs, other things that are coming online. But one of the things that we really need is both the state government, really ultimately the federal government, to help increase the production of these things so they become much more widely available much more quickly. I think that will help in making schools safer. Until that time, I think schools are going to have to rely on the current PCR technology, and I'm not convinced that we're going to have enough testing available for everybody as much as we need it based on that old technology. So I'm hoping we can get some new technology to bail us out on this.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jha. And you know, we've been working hard in terms of putting in place the assurance that we will have the manufacturing capability and to produce everything from PPE to rapid testing to what we hope will be a vaccine. I know I've talked about this on calls in the past, and you've heard me talk about the Pandemic Production Act, but basically having a robust federal public-private partnership, just like we do with our national defense, so that we can bring those manufacturing jobs back home to the United States, not become so reliant on a foreign supply chain, and have control over the ramp that we need to achieve to get testing kits, to get gowns, masks, gloves, all the things that we ran short of back in the spring. Okay, Superintendent Paris, the Mass Department of Education and Secondary Education have introduced guidelines for the fall. What are these guidelines? What do they look like? Asks Charlie C. from Dracut.
Yeah, great question. So the guidelines were released to the districts about a month ago, and they really clearly state that the goal for districts in Massachusetts is for a safe return for as many students as possible in person. It does ask us to design 3 different plans, keeping in mind all the safety and health protocols that are in place. And so those 3 plans include a plan for continued remote learning, a plan for full in-person, and then what we call a hybrid, which is a combination of those things. And so districts are working really hard. We're working really hard in Lawrence to gather feedback from our stakeholders, of course, our families, our staff members, and community, to get a sense of when we design these plans, what is the data needed in order to accommodate one of these plans. And so that's exactly what we're doing, designing for remote learning, continuing robust remote learning, designing for having students back in our buildings safely. And an example of what that will look like in Lawrence is that we are what we call pressure testing classrooms. So if you can envision a classroom of about 600 square feet, that's the average, and we have about 25 desks. If we pull them apart between 3 and 6 feet, that's sort of what we call pressure testing. And so we get to see what's the capacity in that model. And in the model of remote learning is exactly what we have experienced to the extent that we would make it more robust. And then, of course, the traditional model would be just in full with the students. As we mentioned, the hybrid model would be a combination of those 2.
Oh, terrific! That is great. You know, my daughters attend public schools in Westford, and I filled out my survey to provide input.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Yes, you know, you have to fill out your census form. You have to fill out your
That's right.
surveys.
That's right. That's right.
So the next question is from me. It's from David B. And he asks, the president has redirected the hospital's reporting of daily coronavirus results from the CDC to the White House. Since science and the accurate reporting of facts is not a strength of the White House, by what authority can he do this? And what is Congress doing to stop this potential manipulation of clinical data and to return control of reporting public health issues back to the public health departments. Well, David is paying attention. Thank you for the question. You're right. I would agree. Science and transparency have not been strong suits of this White House. And it is incredibly concerning that this administration would order hospitals to change how they report COVID-19 data to the government, bypassing the CDC in the midst of this pandemic. House Democrats and members of the Oversight Committee immediately responded, called upon the administration to reverse that decision and restored the data collection role back to the CDC so that it would just be free from any political interference. And following that outcry, the administration restored public access to the coronavirus data reported by hospitals on Monday. The data went live. It's on a new system called HHS Protect, which is run by a private contractor called Tele-Town. And this contractor was awarded a $10 million contract in April. According to the administration, this change was necessary because senior officials thought that the CDC system was too slow or unable to keep up with the constantly changing information about the virus. But this move is it's nothing short of political. We know because the president has tried on multiple occasions to undermine the CDC's expertise and has defied their fact-driven public health guidance. So there are still open questions as to whether this data will be kept safe and continue to stay available to the public. And like you, I believe that we must hold the administration accountable and put a stop to any sort of manipulation, which we're all going to be tracking. We're continuing to work on this issue to just make sure that there's no foul play. I don't think I have to tell anybody on this call because I think you all tune in to hear from experts like Dr. Jha and Superintendent Paris. But during a pandemic, the last thing we need is to cause greater confusion with, misinformation, especially among our, states where they're relying on this data and the tracking of this data in our hospitals. So thank you again, David. We're on this, and I appreciate your question. Okay, Dr. Jha, this next one is for you. It's from Joseph C. in Acton. And he asks, what is the health industry's best estimate about whether they can produce a reliable vaccine? And if they can, when might it be commercially available?
Yes, Joseph asks the big question that we all want to know the answer to.
I bet you haven't gotten that one before.
Not in the last hour, Congresswoman. I think I've gone a good hour without it. No, it's the big question. Look, it's really important. It is that light that we need to know at the end of the tunnel. So let me start off with some really good news, which is we had 2 clinical trials out this week, both published in The Lancet, one from the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, another one from the CanSino vaccine in China, both of them basically using similar technologies, but both of them showed a really robust immune response in what was essentially a phase 2 trial. And that's my kind of a little bit of medical speak saying it's early trials. It's not the kind of data that we can use to be confident we're going to have a safe and effective vaccine, but it's really encouraging early information. What we found in both of these vaccines was that it elicited a strong immune response. And I have to say, I was just very pleased as I went through the data. So on to big trials. The AstraZeneca trial is going to be at least 30,000 people. The Moderna is doing a trial, probably 30 to 50,000 people. And we need to let the trials run long enough for safety data. We want to make sure that the vaccines are safe because in my mind, the question is, when will I feel comfortable getting my children and my elderly parents vaccinated? And I want to see enough safety data to get there. And my best guess, and this is a guess, but my best guess is that we will have safety data and we'll have efficacy data on whether the vaccine actually works or not, probably near the end of this calendar year. Could it be November? It's possible, October, November, but I think it's more likely like December. But again, we're just guessing here. One of the things that the federal government has done actually quite well, and I feel like I criticize them for all their mishaps. I should praise them when they're doing something well, is a program called Operation Warp Speed, overseen by, not surprisingly, Tony Fauci. So Dr. Fauci has been overseeing Operation Warp Speed, which is getting production of these vaccines going even before we have a final answer, so that if it turns out that the vaccines really work, they become available. So put all of that together, and my guess is that we're going to see frontline workers, doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, others, EMTs. Probably by the end of this year, they'll start getting some of these vaccines, and I think a lot of other folks, February, March, April. There's a lot that goes on between just finding that the vaccine works, producing it safely, making sure that each vaccine is high quality. We want to get it right. And even though we're all in a rush, we don't want to cut corners in a way that will leave people exposed to an unsafe product. I'm confident we'll get there, but it will get us at least into 2021 and probably the late first quarter, early second quarter.
Well, that is a reason to be optimistic. And, we've been getting briefed a lot on Operation Warp Speed, and there's no question that we've put significant resources behind that program so that we can get a safe and scalable vaccine as quickly as possible. So thank you for that. I think you just sort of gave some confidence and optimism to everyone who is listening in. So Cynthia, what are the biggest concerns you are hearing from parents? And what are your concerns? This is a question from Catherine S. in Haverhill.
Yeah, we in conversations with our families, what we've learned is that kids miss each other. They miss their teachers, they miss their community. So that sense of connection is really, we're having this deep longing for being together again as a community. And so that concerns is social emotional, the way I think about it, right? That concerns me because schools are the place where we build community, and we haven't been together for months now. So how do you support students and families and staff to reconnect during, still a pretty risky time? And what comes first, right? For us, it's really important to reconnect us as a community and to support our social emotional needs, and at the same time address the academics. So I think families would agree that getting back to school is important for those reasons, for the human connection that students need to be with each other and to be with the adults that care about them. I also deeply believe that. I believe that that's what we're in the business of, to creating these communities. So that is a huge concern of us. How do we continue to support each other and while also maintaining the academics piece?
Terrific. And, what you opened with is, it's so resonant. I've got 6 and 10-year-old daughters, and kids are missing each other. And, I am often in the Committee on Education and Labor, just fighting for and making sure that we are protecting our teachers and our workers and our students. But I think everyone is hopeful that we're going to find a way. We're going to be exhaustive in our creativity and our innovation on how we can do that, and sort of bring our students and our teachers, back together, because that is it's definitely being craved in my household, and I just see the effects of it on my children's sort of emotions. So thank you for that answer. It's so important to so many of us. The next question is for me, and it's linked to what we were just talking about. How will parents be expected to go back to work if school-age children are either not in school full-time, or they're sent home to learn remotely if and when COVID returns? That's from Johnny S. in Carlisle. So hi, Johnny. I want to thank you for your question. This very question is on the mind of every parent with a young child as our economies and our workplaces reopen. Like many of you during these times, I've transitioned to remote work while juggling the demands of family life. And I'll tell you, it's no easy task being both a mom to two young girls who are in elementary school and a legislator. But I'm fortunate to have help from my husband, my friends, and some family members. But that's just not the case for so many working families, which is why it's incredibly important for us to invest in quality and affordable childcare. Even before this pandemic, families and childcare providers were operating on razor-thin margins, and the situation has grown even more dire. That's why next week, while I'm here in Washington, we'll be considering the Child Care is Essential Act, which would create a $50 billion child care stabilization fund within the existing Child Care and Development Block Grant program. And the Child Care for Economic Recovery Act, which through federal investments and tax subsidies would expand the availability of quality child care and help workers return to their jobs safely and with that peace of mind that their child is safe and cared for too. Both pieces of legislation are critical to enabling our recovery and also us getting through this the rest of this year. But frankly, childcare is an essential public good, and it is central to our economy. It has taken us far too long to treat it as such, but I do think one of the benefits that we have with electing more women to this institution is that everyone understands how critical childcare is to our economy. That buzzer in the background, I wish I could turn off. I unfortunately can't because I have to vote soon, but we're going to get to the next question. Trust me, they allot us plenty of time now so that we can enter the House floor and still be socially distant from each other. So we have time for a few more questions. And this one is for Dr. Jha. It is Earl P. It's from Earl P. in Methuen. He asks, is it possible that one's immune system can prevent COVID-19?
So, Earl, it's a good question. I'm assuming you mean it's for somebody who has not been previously infected. So let me take on kind of both parts of it. By the way, right now, based on the best evidence we have, we do think if you've been infected and recovered, that you really should not be able to get reinfected. Most people won't. And we obviously don't know how long that immunity lasts. We've only known about this virus for 6 months. But I suspect that it will give you enough protection for at least some period of time. I think, Earl, you may be getting at a different issue, which some people have kind of brought around, which is the idea that maybe there's a bunch of natural immunity to this virus, maybe from cross-reactivity to common cold viruses that can also be coronaviruses. This is an idea that has been thrown around, but I have not seen any evidence that this is the case, nor am I particularly hopeful. I mean, it'd be great if a lot of people had natural immunity, but we just haven't seen the kind of data that would suggest that it's widespread. So a science-based answer is we don't really know yet, and people are looking into it. But based on the data I have seen so far, I doubt that very many people have natural immunity to this virus. I think most of us are likely susceptible.
Okay, thank you. Cynthia, this one is for you. So you described the 3 scenarios that you're currently planning for, but can you give us some insight in terms of what you're imagining schools will look like on day 1? You described sort of the classroom, but, overall, throughout the school, on the bus, and how will that change when COVID returns? That's a question from David G. in Boxborough.
Thanks, David, for your question. Yeah, so we are definitely envisioning that if you can just picture a bunch of first graders and high schoolers and, across the levels, kids coming in with their mask, kids being asked to wash their hands when they first enter the building, desks between 3 and 6 feet apart, depending on the size of the classroom, and then being very restricted to that space to minimize risk of infection. If you can imagine the teacher in front of her students, again with the proper PPE, carrying on with instruction, right? You can imagine and we can envision on the first day that kids are going to need things like recess, and we'll accommodate that in a way that's safe, specifically now that the weather is still good for being outside. If you can envision us making adjustments for snack time, bringing lunch into the classroom versus going into the cafeteria. And then with respect to the buses, you know, the current guidelines has us at having kids in every other seat, and that's like 1 student, 2 students per seat. So those are things that we're still working out with our partners and our organizations that we work with. But it'll be a very dramatic new place, because what we do at the beginning of school is what I had mentioned earlier, is we connect with each other. And what that looks like is a lot of hugging, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of high fives. And so school will start without that. School will be a very, very different feel this year. And in addition, we're also envisioning that there will be points if and when we have surges, that we will return to remote learning. And what that means is that we'll have a similar experience that we had this late spring, summer, which is students will be back in front of their Chromebooks or their laptops, and teachers will be on platforms like Zoom and Google Classrooms, back to instructing students. But it'll feel different, you know, just the simple fact that we're not going to be able to hug students on the return and off the buses and high fives and all those things that we love about the beginning of school. It'll feel and look very different.
Well, thank you for painting that picture. I stuck with you through all of it. And I think as a result, I'll be able to sort of set expectations with my own girls. So I really appreciate that. Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions, and they're not going to be to me because I want to take full advantage of our expert panel. So Dr. Jha, on sort of following on to that last question, what do we know about the exposure of children to the virus? How likely is it for a toddler or an infant to contract or carry the virus? Do potential guidelines not mandating masks for kindergarten and first graders put teachers and students at risk? I'm thinking about this for my own kids at school. And while we look at reopening, and that's from Julie B. in Chelmsford.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll tell you where we are on the science of this. So there have been a lot of studies that have tried to assess, do kids, well, a couple of things. What we know is that kids are less likely to get super sick, but the studies have tried to assess are kids less likely to get infected? We think the answer is probably not. I think they're just as susceptible to getting infected. They just don't get very sick when they get infected. Then the second question is, do they transmit the virus as efficiently as adults? And that's really important as you get kids back into school, is that if they become super efficient transmitters, then we're going to have a problem. And there are a lot of studies out there, but I'll give you my best read of the literature, including a really nice high-quality study done out of South Korea that came out this past weekend. I think the overwhelming evidence right now is that kids 10 or younger, both of the Congresswoman's children, for instance, and one of mine, so younger kids do seem to transmit the virus a lot less efficiently. And that's really good news. What the data seems to suggest is older kids, high schoolers, probably transmit the virus as efficiently as adults. It's not surprising, right? Like, they're physically like adults. They mentally may not quite be like adults yet, but from a physical point of view, they're like adults. And that, in my mind, means we should probably think about K to 5 differently than the way we think about high school in terms of risk. And I have been pushing, and I had an op-ed this week in the Boston Globe about why it's so important to get kids back in and what we need to do to get kids back in safely. is that we should have a lower threshold for getting K-5 back in person, and maybe deal with a bit more time of high schoolers trying to do stuff through Zoom. It's not great, and I'd like to get everybody back in. But based on the evidence, I think we can get most kids back to school in the Commonwealth this fall, and we should really try to get all the K-5 back in. It's really important for the kids. Good for parents too, but particularly important for the kids.
Well, that's great, and thank you for sharing that study with us. Because at a time where I don't get to pass on a lot of good news to my young ones, I'm eager to FaceTime them tonight and share this with them. It's not so great for our college-age boys, but they're used to acting like adults, so it won't be a surprise. And the last question for you, Cynthia, what did we learn from the spring in terms of best practices for remote learning? It was such an adjustment for so many of our students, but I'm sure you've been wringing out the lessons this summer. That's a question from Alicia J. in Carlisle.
Thanks, Alicia, for that question. Yeah, what we learned is that the resiliency of our kids and families is enormous, and we can't take that for granted. And then with respect to the academics, what we learned is that kids continue to prefer to have a grown-up in front of them who has touch points, what we call touch points with them at least once or twice a week, in addition to that Zoom or that platform, whatever platform they're using, right? And so it's also true for the families. I appreciate it when I got a call or email from my teachers. And so those two things were really important moving forward, that we still are able to make a personal phone call or send an email, and that when we do engage in the platforms, that there is not just recordings or lessons sent, that it's both synchronous and asynchronous opportunities that our students are experiencing. As an example of that, we learned that our younger kids, when we dropped off physical education sort of care packages, what we called, like jump ropes and balls and hula hoops, those combined with the teacher in front of them, right, the hands-on things, were highly engaging. So younger kids need both. Our older students can handle a little bit more independent work, but still need a lot of feedback and guidance and structure. And those are good lessons for us as we plan for more robust remote learning in the future. But I think overall, we know that face-to-face instruction is best, followed by a combination of synchronous and asynchronous instruction.
Great. That actually makes perfect sense. So unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Jha and Superintendent Paris again for sharing so much important information with us. We are so grateful for your time and the expertise that you bring to this discussion. And I know that everyone who tuned in appreciates you too. And I want to thank everyone who dialed in. Staying informed by experts is great preparation for the road ahead. So for an easy way to stay updated on federal and state response to COVID-19, as well as information on future Tele-Town halls and events, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Rep. Lori Trahan. You can also visit our website, which is trahan.house.gov/COVID-19 for resources that are important to your family or your small business. Finally, and I can't say it enough, we all have a job to do for our communities and most importantly for our schools to begin reopening, our small businesses who want us to come back and shop and dine. But we must continue to be vigilant in reducing the spread of this virus. And we do that by wearing a mask and by maintaining social distance and washing our hands, staying home when we can. So with that, I want to thank you all again. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll talk again soon.